So, welcome to another show. Today's show, we're going to be discussing Plato and his allegory of the cave. So, we're going to discuss what the allegory is about, as well as what the underlying meaning is. So, maybe before we talk about it, let's explain what an allegory is. So, for those who don't know, Plato was a student of Socrates. And so there's not really much in the way of, well, there's nothing really written from Socrates. So a lot of things that are written about Socrates are from Plato, and obviously Aristotle came from Plato, etc. So an allegory is a story, and it's used to represent sort of abstract ideas, moral principles or ethics, or maybe to try and display some historical events that have happened. As with any sort of story that has a moral to it, there's obviously the literal story, how the story unfolds, what happens with the characters, what's the plot. But then there's also the symbolic level and the pragmatic level where the deeper meaning and the message is conveyed. So essentially, you could argue that it's a thought experiment. So let's explain the allegory. So it's a story from his book, The Republic, and this is how it goes. So again, this is my own sort of explanation of it, but it's basically a cave, and there's a group of prisoners that have lived there since birth. They're chained inside the cave, and they are facing some sort of wall. Behind them, they have a fire. And between the fire and the prisoners, there are objects placed, and that obviously casts shadows on the wall in front of the prisoners. The prisoners obviously perceive these shadows, don't they? And they perceive them as reality. Following this, one of the prisoners is freed from the chains, and he's actually let outside the cave. So he gets outside, obviously, it must be dazzling for him. He's not seeing real sunlight or anything like that. And it takes a while for his eyes to adjust. Yeah, you'll know this yourself. He realizes then the true nature of what's outside of his cave. He understands that the shadows were just reflections of real objects. He sees the sun, he sees the sky, and he sees everything around him. He then goes back to the cave and tries to share his, new knowledge really with the other prisoners. They don't believe him. They think he's gone mad. They can only observe what they've always observed, and they can't comprehend anything beyond that. They reject his attempts to teach or enlighten them, and he's actually ridiculed and seen as foolish. So, what does this mean then? So, let's start with a basic, really. It's a hero's journey, isn't it? To an extent. Obviously, Joseph Campbell. So, someone's gone away from whether it's the cave, the Shire, or whatever. They've gone out, they've overcome a monster or an obstacle, and they've come back. But there are a lot of other morals to the story as well. You could say, well, actually, just because we sense something, it doesn't mean it's true. Do things exists beyond our own perception. We can try and give people truth, but they could go crazy at you and not believe what you tell them. I mean, this is how Socrates was killed. He opened the eyes, or tried to, of people, and was actually killed for it. Most people are actually stupid and they don't trust other people. They don't trust other people's human nature to try and give them a right answer or try and enlighten them in some way, shape, or form. They throw it back in your face. Look, you've come back to the cave, you're trying to help others see for themselves, but they sometimes want to actually physically see it for themselves and they won't believe what you've told them. Stubborn people then maybe don't want to listen. Or maybe in this example, they just can't comprehend what he means. All they've ever known is this cave. And it's not with anything. I mean, think of your own example here, where you thought something, you've been told a different way of thinking about it, and you can never go back to the original way of thinking ever again. So, so then, is it sometimes best, instead of trying to change others after realizing something, and they reject you anyway, and you conform back to their ideology, isn't it sometimes better to be the black sheep, distance yourself from those friends and family or society because you know you're right and they aren't? They're wrong. You try to help them, but they're too naive, they're too stubborn to listen. The other question then is actually, well, what is reality? Much like the Matrix film, you think you're in reality, but actually Morpheus shows you the real way. And if you remember back to the first film, obviously Neo, when he first finds out, he goes a bit crazy for a second and faints, doesn't he? Because it's such a big shock to the system. So, what perspectives do you have that are maybe casting shadows over the truth? Have you got your blinkers on like a horse does? And is any knowledge actually real? Because you could be getting out of the cave and going into a new cave with slightly improved perspectives, but again, would you escape that? Could there be another cave? I mean, I know for myself, I've learned some things and I think, oh, I really understand this, but actually, I then learn something else, and I then learn something else, and I then learn something else, and I actually realise I didn't know anything. And my perspective at that point was an old program. It was iOS 1 when I should be on iOS 100, for example. Is the outside of the cave though any more real than inside of the cave? Then that's a question in itself. And sometimes, reality is forced upon us. We don't have a choice of what happens. We could be imprisoned, and in some respects we are. We are told things through the schooling system, through governments, through society that may not be correct, and that's why it's up to yourself to educate yourself. And this is also a metaphor for philosophy, and their attempt to enlighten others, but seen as a misfit, as I said with Socrates before. Those thinkers that are ready to go against the grain, at that point they might be seen as foolish, but when you actually go forward in time, you realize what genius they had. And just as a final point, really, just remember, some people just aren't ready to leave the cage. You might tell them about the fractional reserve banking system. You might tell them how human nature on the bad sense operates. You might tell them many things, but they don't want to listen. And it's up to their own maturity and modesty to listen to you, or want to change. But then, is there a case of Stockholm syndrome here, when you might hate the system, you might hate whatever it may be, being the prisoner in this example, but in some way you love it? And is that the world that we live in today? We hate the system, yet we love the system. We continue to try and strive to be as good as we can within it. Is it a case then of ignorance is bliss? And I would say probably not.